Chapter 13. Mac and the boys slept peacefully on the pine needles. Sometime before dawn, Eddie came back. He had gone a long way before he found a Model T, and then when he did, he wondered whether or not it would be a good idea to take the needle out of its seat. It might not fit. So he took the whole carburetor. The boys didn't wake up when he got back. He lay down beside them and slept under the pine trees. There was one nice thing about Model Ts. The parts were not only interchangeable, they were unidentifiable. There is a beautiful view from the Carmel Grade, the curving bay with the waves creaming on the sand, the dune country around Seaside, and right at the bottom of the hill, the warm intimacy of the town. Mac got up in the dawn and hustled his pants where they bound him, and he stood looking down on the bay. He could see some of the pursigners coming in. A tanker stood over against Seaside, taking on oil. Behind him, the rabbit stirred in the bush. Then the sun came up and shook the night chill out of the air, the way you'd shake a rug. When he felt the first sun warmth, Mac shivered. The boys ate a little bread while Eddie installed a new carburetor, and when it was ready, they didn't bother to crank it. They pushed it out to the highway and coasted in gear until it started. And then Eddie driving, they backed up over the rise, over the top, and turned then headed forward and down past Hatton Fields. In Carmel Valley, the artichoke plant stood gray-green, and the willows were lush along the river. They turned left up the valley. Luck blossomed from the first. A dusty Rhode Island red rooster who had wandered too far from his own farmyard crossed the road, and Eddie hit him without running too far off the road. Sitting in the back of the truck, Hazel picked him as they went and let the feathers fly from his hand, the most widely distributed evidence on record, for there was a little breeze in the morning blowing down from Jamesburg, and some of the red chicken feathers were deposited on Point Lobos, and some even blew out to sea. The Carmel is a lovely little river. It isn't very long, but in its course it has everything rivers should have. It rises in the mountains and tumbles down a well, runs through shallows, is dammed to make a lake, spills over the dam, crackles among round boulders, wanders lazily under sycamores, spills into pools where trout live, drops in against banks where crayfish live. In the winter it becomes a torrent, a mean little fierce river, and in the summer it is a place for children to wade in and for fishermen to wander in. Frogs blink from its banks, and the deep ferns grow beside it. Deer and foxes come to drink from it, secretly, in the morning and evening, and now and then a mountain lion crouched flat laps its water. The farms of the rich little valley back up the river and take its water for the orchards and vegetables. The quail call beside it, and the wild doves come whistling in at dusk. Raccoons pace its edges, looking for frogs. It's everything a river should be. A few miles up the valley, the river cuts in under a high cliff from which vines and ferns hang down. At the base of this cliff there is a pool, green and deep, and on the other side of the pool there is a little sandy place where it is good to sit and cook your dinner. Mac and the boys come down to this place happily. It was perfect. If frogs were available, they would be here. It was a place to relax, a place to be happy. On the way out, they had thriven. In addition to the big red chicken, there was a sack of carrots which had fallen from a vegetable truck, half a dozen onions which had not. Mac had a bag of coffee in his pocket. In the truck, there was a 5-gallon can with the top cut off. The winning jug was nearly half full. Such things as salt and pepper had been brought. Mac and the boys would have thought anyone who traveled without salt, pepper, and coffee very silly indeed. Without effort, confusion, or much thought, 4 round stones were rolled together on a little beach. The rooster who had challenged the sunrise of the very day lay dismembered and clean in water in the 5-gallon can with peeled onions about him, while a little fire of dead willow sticks sputtered between the stones, a very little fire. Only fools build big fires. It would take a long time to cook this rooster, for it had taken him a long time to achieve his size and muscularity. But as the water began to boil gently about him, he smelled good from the beginning. Mac gave them a pep talk. "The best time for frogs is at night," he said, "so I guess we'll just lay around till it gets dark." They sat in the shade, and gradually, one by one, they stretched out and slept. Mac was right. Frogs do not move around much in the daytime. They hide under ferns, and they look secretly out of holes under rocks. The way to catch frogs is with a flashlight at night. The men slept knowing they might have a very active night. Only Hazel stayed awake to replenish the little fire under the cooking chicken. There was no golden afternoon next to the cliff. When the sun went over it at about 2 o'clock, a whispering shade came to the beach. The sycamores rustled in the afternoon breeze. Little water snakes slipped down to the rocks and then gently entered the water and swam along through the pool, their heads held up like little periscopes and a tiny wake spreading behind them. A big trout jumped in the pool. The gnats and mosquitoes which avoid the sun came out and buzzed over the water. All of the sun bugs, the flies, the dragonflies, the wasps, the hornets went home. And as a shadow came to the beach, as the first quail began to call, Mac and the boys awakened. The smell of the chicken stew was heartbreaking. Hazel had picked a fresh bay leaf from a tree by the river, and he had dropped it in. The carrots were in now. Coffee in its own can was simmering on its own rock far enough from the flame, so that it did not boil too hard. Mac awakened, started up, stretched, staggered to the pool, washed his face with cupped hands, hacked, spat, washed out his mouth, broke winds, tightened his belt, scratched his legs, combed his wet hair with his fingers, drank from the jug, belched, and sat down by the fire. "By God, that smells good," he said. Men all do about the same things when they wake up. Mac's process was loosely the one all of them followed, and soon they had all come to the fire and complimented Hazel. Hazel stuck his pocket knife into the muscles of the chicken. "He ain't going to be what you'd call tender," said Hazel. "You'd have to cook him about 2 weeks to get him tender. How old about do you judge he was, Mac?" "I'm 48, and I ain't as tough as he is," said Mac. Eddie said, "How old can a chicken get, do you think? That's if nobody pushes him around or he don't get sick." "That's something nobody isn't ever going to find out," said Jones. It was a pleasant time. The jug went around and warmed them. Jones said, "Eddie, I don't mean to complain none, I was just thinking. Suppose you had 2 or 3 jugs back at the bar. Suppose you put all the whiskey in one, and all the wine in the other, and all the beer in another." A slightly shocked silence followed the suggestion. "I didn't mean nothing," said Jones quickly. I like it this way." Jones talked too much then, because he knew he had made a social blunder, and he wasn't able to stop. "What I like about it this way is you never know what kind of a drunk you're going to get out of it," he said. "You take whiskey," he said hurriedly, "you more or less know what you'll do. A fine guy fights and a crying guy cries, but this," he said magnanimously, "why don't you know whether it'll run up a peach vine or start you swimming to Santa Cruz? It's more fun that way," he said weakly. "Speaking of swimming," said Mac to fill in a delicate place in the conversation to shut Jones up. "I wonder whatever happened to that guy McKinley Warren. Remember that deep-sea diver?" "I remember him," said Louie. "I and him used to hang around together. He just didn't get much work, and then he got to drinking. It's kind of tough on you, diving and drinking. Got to worrying, too. Finally, he sold his suit and helmet and pump and went on a hell of a junk, and then he left town. I don't know where he went. He wasn't no good after he went down for that wop that got took down with the anchor from the 12 brothers. McKinley just dove down, bust his eardrums, and he wasn't no good after that. Didn't hurt the wop a bit." Mac sampled the jug again. "He used to make a lot of dough during Prohibition," Mac said. "Used to get $25 a day from the government to dive looking for liquor at the bottom, and he got $3 a case of Louis for not finding it. Had it worked out, so he brought up 1 case a day to keep the government happy. Louis didn't mind that none. Made it so they didn't get in no new divers. McKinley made a lot of dough." "Yeah," said Huey, "but he's like everybody else. Gets some dough, and he wants to get married. He got married 3 times before his dough run out. I could always tell. He'd buy a white fox fur piece, and bang! Next thing you know, he's married." "I wonder what happened to Gay?" Eddie asked. It was the first time they had spoken of him. "Same thing, I guess," said Mac. "You just can't trust a married guy. No matter how much he hates his old lady, why, he'll go back to her. Get to thinking and brooding, and back he'll go. You can't trust him no more. Take Gay," said Mac. "His old lady hits him. But I bet you when Gay's away from her 3 days, he gets it figured out that it's his fault, and he goes back to make it up to her." They ate long and daintily, spearing out pieces of chicken, holding the dripping pieces until they cooled, and then gnawing the muscled meat from the bone. They speared the carrots on pointed willow switches, and finally they passed the can and drank the juice. And around them the evening crept in as delicately as music. The quail called each other down to the water. The trout jumped in the pool, and the moths came down and fluttered around the pool as the daylight mixed into the darkness. They passed the coffee can about, and they were warm and fed and silent. At last Mac said, "God damn it, I hate a liar." "Who's been lying to you?" Eddie asked. "Oh, I don't mind a guy that tells a little one to get along or to hop up a conversation, but I hate a guy that lies to himself." "Who done that?" Eddie asked. "Me," said Mac, "and maybe you guys. Here we are," he said earnestly. "The whole goddamn shabby lot of us. We worked it out that we wanted to give Doc a party. So we come out here and have a hell of a lot of fun. Then we'll go back and get the dough from Doc. There's 5 of us, so we'll drink 5 times as much liquor as he will. And I ain't sure we're doing it for Doc. I ain't sure we ain't doing it for ourselves. And Doc's too nice a fellow to do that to. Doc is the nicest fellow I ever knew. I don't want to be the kind of guy that would take advantage of him. You know, one time I put the bee on him for $1. I give him a hell of a story. Right in the middle, I seen he knew goddamn well the story wasn't so much malarkey. So right in the middle, I says, Doc, that's a fucking lie. And he put his hand in his pocket and brought out a book. Mac, he says, I figure a guy that needs it bad enough to make up a lie to get it really needs it. And he gave me the book. I paid him that $1 back the next day. I never did spend it, just kept it overnight, and then give it back to him, Hazel said. There ain't nobody likes a party better than Doc. We're giving him the party. What the hell is the beef? I don't know, said Mac. I just like to give him something when I didn't get most of it back. How about a present? Huey suggested. Suppose we just bought the whiskey and give it to him and let him do what he wants. Now you're talking, said Mac. That's just what we'll do. We'll just give him the whiskey and fade out. You know what'll happen, said Eddie. Henry and them people from Carmel will smell that whiskey out, and then instead of only 5 of us, there'll be 20. Doc told me one time himself they can smell him frying a steak from Cannery Row, clear down to Point Sur. I don't see the percentage. He'd come out better if we give him the party ourselves. Mac considered this reasoning. Maybe you're right, he said at last, but suppose we give him something except whiskey, maybe cufflinks with his initials. Oh, horse shit, said Hazel. Doc don't want stuff like that. The night was in by now, and the stars were white in the sky. Hazel fed the fire, and it put a little room of light on the beach. Over the hill a fox was barking sharply, and now in the night the smell of sage come down from the hills. The water chuckled on the stones where it went out of the deep pool. Mac was mulling over the last piece of reasoning when the sound of footsteps on the ground made them turn. A man, dark and large, stalked near, and he had a shotgun over his arm, and a pointer walked shyly and delicately at his heel. What the hell are you doing here? He asked. Nothing, said Mac. The land's posted. No fishing, hunting, fires, camping. Now you just pack up and put that fire out and get off this land. Mac stood up humbly. I didn't know, Captain, he said. Honest, we never seen the sign, Captain. There are signs all over. You couldn't have missed them. Look, Captain, we made a mistake, and we're sorry, said Mac. He paused and looked closely at the slouching figure. You are a military man, aren't you, sir? I can always tell. Military man don't carry his shoulders the same as ordinary people. I was in the army so long I can always tell. Imperceptibly, the shoulders of the man straightened. Nothing obvious, but he held himself differently. I don't allow fires on my place, he said. Well, we're sorry, said Mac. We'll get right out, Captain. You see, we're working for some scientists. We're trying to get some frogs. They're working on cancer, and we're helping out getting some frogs. The man hesitated for a moment. What do they do with the frogs? He asked. Well, sir, said Mac, they give cancer to the frogs, and then they can study and experiment, and they got it nearly licked if they can just get some frogs. But you don't want us on your land, Captain. We'll get right out. Never would come in if we knew. Suddenly, Mac seemed to see the pointer for the first time. By God, that's a fine-looking bitch, he said enthusiastically. She looks like Nola that won the field trials in Virginia last year. She Virginia dog, Captain? The captain hesitated, and then he lied. Yes, he said shortly. She's lame. Tick got her right on her shoulder. Mac was instantly solicitous. Mind if I look, Captain? Come, girl. Come, girl. The pointer looked up at her master, and then sidled up to Mac. Pile on some twigs so I can see, he said to Hazel. It's up where she can't lick it, said the captain, and he leaned over Mac's shoulder to look. Mac pressed some pus out of the evil-looking crater on the dog's shoulder. I had a dog once, had a thing like this, and it went right in and killed him. She had pups, didn't she? Yes, said Captain. 6. I put iodine on that place. No, said Mac. That won't draw. You got any Epsom salts up at your place? Yes, there's a big bottle. Well, you make a hot poultice of Epsom salts and put it on there. She's weak, you know, from the pups. Be a shame if she got sick now. You'd lose the pups, too. The pointer looked deep into Mac's eyes, and then she licked his hand. Tell you what I'll do, Captain. I'll look after her myself. Epsom salt'll do you trick. That's the best thing. The captain stroked the dog's head. You know, I've got a pond up by the house that's so full of frogs I can't sleep nights. Why don't you look up there? They bellow all night. I'd be glad to get rid of them." "That's mighty nice of you," said Mac. "I'll bet those dogs would thank you for that. But I'd like to get a poultice on this dog." He turned to the others. "You put out this fire," he said. "Make sure there ain't a spark left and clean up around. You don't want to leave no mess. I and the captain will go and take care of Nola here. You fellows follow along when you get cleared up." Mac and the captain walked away together. Hazel kicked sand on the fire. "I bet Mac could have been president of the U.S. if he wanted," he said. "What could he do with it if he had it?" Jones asked. "There wouldn't be no fun in that." Chapter 14. Early morning is a time of magic in Cannery Row. In the gray time after the light has come and before the sun has risen, the row seems to hang suspended out of time in a silvery light. The street lights go out, and the weeds are a brilliant green. The corrugated iron of the canneries glows with the pearly lucency of platinum or old pewter. No automobiles are running then. The street is silent of progress and business, and the rush and drag of the waves can be heard as they splash in among the piles of the canneries. It is a time of great peace, a deserted time, a little era of rest. Cats drift over the fences and slither like syrup over the ground to look for fish heads. Silent early morning dogs parade majestically, picking and choosing judiciously whereon to pee. The seagulls come flapping in to sit on the cannery roofs to await the day or refuse. They sit on the roof peaks shoulder to shoulder. From the rocks near the Hopkins Marine Station comes the barking of sea lions like the baying of hounds. The air is cool and fresh. In the back gardens, the gophers push up the morning mounds of fresh, damp earth, and they creep out and drag flowers into their holes. Very few people are about, just enough to make it seem more deserted than it is. One of Dora's girls comes home from a call on her patron, too wealthy or too sick to visit the Bear Flag. Her makeup is a little sticky and her feet are tired. Lee Chong brings the garbage cans out and stands them on the curb. The old Chinaman comes out of the sea and flaps across the street and up past the palace. The cannery watchmen look out and blink at the morning light. The bouncer at Bear Flag steps out on the porch in his shirt sleeves and stretches and yawns and scratches his stomach. The snores of Mr. Malloy's tenants in the pipes have a deep, tunnely quality. It is the hour of the pearl, the interval between day and night when time stops and examines itself. On such a morning and in such a light, 2 soldiers and 2 girls strolled easily along the street. They had come out of La Ida, and they were very tired and very happy. The girls were hefty, big-breasted, and strong, and their blonde hair was in slight disarray. They wore printed rayon party dresses, wrinkled now and clinging to their convexities, and each girl wore a soldier's cap, one far back on her head and the other with the visor down, almost on her nose. They were full-lipped, broad-nosed, hippie girls, and they were very tired. The shoulders' tunics were unbuttoned, and their belts were threaded through their epaulets. The ties were pulled down a little so the shirt collars could be unbuttoned, and the soldiers wore the girls' hats, one a tiny yellow straw boater with a bunch of daisies on the crown, the other a white knitted half hat to which medallions of blue cellophane adhered. They walked holding hands, swinging their hands rhythmically. The soldier on the outside had a large brown paper bag filled with cold canned beer. They strolled softly in the pearly light. They had a hell of a time, and they felt good. They smiled delicately like weary children remembering a party. They looked at one another and smiled, and they swung their hands. Past the Bear Flag they went and said, "Hiya!" to the bouncer, who was scratching his stomach. They listened to the snores from the pipes and laughed a little. At Lee Chong's they stopped and looked into the messy display window, where tools and clothes and food crowded for attention. Swinging their hands and scuffling their feet, they came to the end of Cannery Row and turned up to the railroad track. The girls climbed up the rails and walked along them, and the soldiers put their arms around the plump waists to keep them from falling. Then they went past the boat works and turned down into the park-like property of the Hopkins Marine Station. There is a tiny curved beach in front of the station, a miniature beach between little reefs. The gentle morning waves licked up the beach and whispered softly. The fine smell of seaweed came from the exposed rocks. As the 4 came to the beach, a sliver of the sun broke over Tom Work's land across the head of the bay, and it gilded the water and made the rocks yellow. The girls sat firmly down in the sand and straightened their skirts over their knees. One of the soldiers bunched holes in 4 cans of beer and handed them around. And then the men lay down and put their heads in the girls' laps and looked up into their faces, and they smiled at each other, a tired and peaceful and wonderful secret. From up near the station came the barking of the dog. A watchman, a dark and surly man, had seen them, and his black and surly cocker spaniel had seen them. He shouted at them, and when they did not move, he came down on the beach and his dog barked monotonously. "Don't you know you can't lay around here? You gotta get off. This is private property." The soldiers did not even seem to hear him. They smiled on, and the girls were stroking their hair over the temples. At last, in slow motion, one of the soldiers turned his head so that his cheek was cradled between the girl's legs. He smiled benevolently at the caretaker. "Why don't you take a flying fug at the moon?" he said kindly, and he turned back to look at the girl. The sun lighted her blonde hair, and she scratched him over one ear. They didn't even see the caretaker go back to his house. Chapter 15. By the time the boys got up to the farmhouse, Mac was in the kitchen. The pointer bitch lay on her side, and Mac held a cloth saturated with Epsom salts against her tick bite. Among her legs, the big fat wiener pups nuzzled and bumped for milk, and the bitch looked patiently up to Mac's face, saying, "You see how it is? I try to tell him, but he doesn't understand." The captain held a lamp and looked down on Mac. "I'm glad to know about that," he said. Mac said, "I don't want to tell you about your business, sir, but these pups ought to be weaned. She ain't got a hell of a lot of milk left, and them pups are chewing her to pieces." "I know," said the captain. "I suppose I should have drowned them all but one. I've been so busy trying to keep the place going. People don't take the interest in bird dogs they used to. It's all poodles and boxers and Dobermans." "I know," said Mac, "and there ain't no dog like a pointer for a man. I don't know what's come over people, but you wouldn't have drowned them, would you, sir?" "Well," said the captain, "since my wife went into politics, I'm just running crazy. She got elected to the assembly for this district, and when the legislature isn't in session, she's off making speeches, and when she's home, she's studying all the time and writing bills." "Must be lousy, and it must be pretty lonely," said Mac. "Now, if I had a pup like this," he picked up a squirming fuzz-faced pup, "why, I bet I'd have a real bird dog in 3 years. I'd take a bitch every time." "Would you like to have one?" the captain asked. Mac looked up. "You mean you let me have one? Oh, Jesus Christ, yes." "Take your pick," said the captain. "Nobody seems to understand bird dogs anymore." The boys stood in the kitchen and gathered quick impressions. It was obvious that the wife was away. The open cans, the frying pan with lace from fried eggs still sticking to it, the crumbs on the kitchen table, the open box of shotgun shells on the bread box, all shrieked of the lack of a woman, while the white curtains and the papers on the dish shelves and the 2 small towels on the rack told them a woman had been there, and they were unconsciously glad she wasn't there. The kind of women who put papers on shelves and had little towels like that instinctively distrusted and disliked Mac and the boys. Such women knew that they were the worst threats to a home, for they offered ease and thought and companionship as opposed to neatness, order, and properness. They were very glad she was away. Now the captain seemed to feel that they were doing him a favor. He didn't want them to leave. He said hesitantly, "Suppose you boys would like a little something to warm you up before you go out for the frogs." The others looked at Mac. Mac was frowning as though he was thinking it through. "When we're out doing scientific stuff, we make it a kind of rule not to touch nothing," he said, and then quickly, as though he might have gone too far. "But seeing as how you been so nice to us, well, I wouldn't mind a short one myself. I don't know about the boys." The boys agreed that they wouldn't mind a short one either. The captain got a flashlight and went down in the cellar. They could hear him moving lumber and boxes about, and he came back upstairs with a 5-gallon oak keg in his arms. He set it on the table. "During Prohibition, I got some corn whiskey and laid it away. I just got to thinking I'd like to see how it is. It's pretty old now. I'd almost forgot it. You see, my wife—" He let it go at that because it was apparent that they understood. The captain knocked out the oak plug from the end of the keg and got glasses down from the shelf that had scallop-edged paper laid on it. It is a hard job to pour a small drink from a 5-gallon keg. Each of them got half a water glass of the clear brown liquor. They waited ceremoniously for the captain, and then they said, "Over the river," and tossed it back. They swallowed, tasted their tongues, sucked their lips, and there was a far-away look in their eyes. Mac peered into his empty glass as though some holy message were written in the bottom, and then he raised his eyes. "You can't say nothing about that," he said. "They don't put that in bottles." He breathed in deeply and sucked his breath as it came out. "I don't think I ever tasted nothing as good as that," he said. The captain looked pleased. His glance wandered back to the keg. "It is good," he said. "You think we might have another little one?" Mac stared into his glass again. "Maybe a short one," he agreed. "Wouldn't it be easier to pour out some in a pitcher? You're liable to spill it that way." 2 hours later, they recalled what they had come for. The frog pool was square, 50 feet wide, and 70 feet long and 4 feet deep. Lush, soft grass grew about its edge, and a little ditch brought the water from the river to it, and from it, little ditches went around out to the orchards. There were frogs there all night, thousands of them. Their voices beat the night, they boomed and barked and croaked and rattled. They sang to the stars, to the waning moon, to the waving grasses. They bellowed love songs and challenges. The men crept through the darkness toward the pool. The captain carried a nearly filled pitcher of whiskey, and every man had his own glass. The captain had found them flashlights that worked. Huey and Jones carried gunny sacks. As they drew quietly near, the frogs heard them coming. The night had been roaring with frog song, and then suddenly it was silent. Mac and the boys and the captain sat down on the ground to have one last short one and to map their campaign, and the plan was bold. During the millennia that frogs and men have lived in the same world, it is probable that men have hunted frogs, and during that time a pattern of hunt and prey has developed. The man with net or bow or lance or gun creeps noisily as he thinks toward the frog. The pattern requires that the frog sit still, sit very still and wait. The rules of the game require the frog to wait until the final flicker of a second when the net is descending, when the lance is in the air, when the finger squeezes the trigger, then the frog jumps, plops into the water, and swims to the bottom and waits until the man goes away. That is the way it is done, the way it has always been done. Frogs have every right to expect it will always be done that way. Now and then the net is too quick, the lance pierces, the gun flicks, and that frog is gone. But it is all fair and in the framework. Frogs don't resent that. But how could they have anticipated Mac's new method? How could they have foreseen the horror that followed? The sudden flashing of lights, the shouting and squealing of men, the rush of feet. Every frog leaped, plopped into the pool, and swam frantically to the bottom. Then into the pool plunged a line of men, stamping and churning, moving in a crazy line of the pool, flinging their feet about. Hysterically, the frogs, displaced from their placid spots, swam ahead of the crazy thrashing feet, and the feet came on. Frogs are good swimmers, but they haven't much endurance. Down the pool they went until finally they were bunched and crowded against the end, and the feet and wildly plunging bodies followed them. A few frogs lost their heads and floundered among the feet and got through, and these were saved. But the majority decided to leave this pool forever, to find a new home in a new country, where this kind of thing didn't happen. A wave of frantic, frustrated frogs, big ones, little ones, brown ones, green ones, men frogs and women frogs, a wave of them broke over the bank, crawled, leaped, scrambled. They clambered up the grass, they clutched at each other, little ones rode on big ones, and then, horror on horror, the flashlights found them. 2 men gathered them like berries. The line came out of the water and closed in on their rear and gathered them like potatoes. 10s and 50s of them were flung into the gunny sacks, and the sacks filled with tired, frightened, and disillusioned frogs, with dripping, whimpering frogs. Some got away, of course, and some had been saved in the pool, but never in frog history had such an execution taken place. Frogs by the pound, by the 50 pounds. They weren't counted, but there must have been 600 or 700. Then happily Mac tied up the necks of the sacks. They were soaking, dripping wet, and the air was cool. They had a short one in the grass before they went back to the house so they wouldn't catch colds. It is doubtful whether the captain had ever had so much fun. He was indebted to Mac and the boys. Later, when the curtains caught fire and were put out with the little towels, the captain told the boys not to mind it. He felt it was an honor to have them burn his house clear down if they wanted to. "My wife is a wonderful woman," he said in a kind of peroration. "Most wonderful woman. Ought to have been a man. If she was a man, I wouldn't have married her." He laughed a long time over that and repeated it 3 or 4 times and resolved to remember it so he could tell it to a lot of other people. He filled a jug with whiskey and gave it to Mac. He wanted to go to live with them in the palace flop house. He decided that his wife would like Mac and the boys if she only knew them. Finally, he went to sleep on the floor with his head among the puppies. Mac and the boys poured themselves a short one and regarded him seriously. Mac said, "He gave me that jug of whiskey, didn't he? You heard him?" "Sure he did," said Eddie. "I heard him." "And he give me a pup?" "Sure, pick of the litter. We all heard him. Why?" "I never did roll a junk, and I ain't gonna start now," said Mac. "We gotta get out of here. He's gonna wake up feeling lousy, and it's gonna be all our fault. I just don't want to be here." Mac glanced at the burned curtains, at the floor glistening with whiskey and puppy dirt, at the bacon grease that was coagulating on the stove front. He went to the pups, looked them over carefully, felt bone and frame, looked in eyes and regarded jaws, and he picked out a beautifully spotted bitch with a liver-colored nose and a fine dark yellow eye. "Come on, darling," he said. They blew out the lamp because of the danger of fire. It was just turning dawn as they left the house. "I don't think I ever had such a fine trip," said Mac, "but I got to thinking about his wife coming back, and it gave me the shivers." The pup whined in his arms, and he put it under his coat. "He's a real nice fella," said Mac. "After you get him feeling easy, that is." He strode on toward the place where they had parked the Ford. "We shouldn't go forgetting we're doing all this for Doc," he said. "From the way things are panning out, it looks like Doc is a pretty lucky guy."